One of the big problems right now across the political divide, the big assumption that people are making over and over again is my side's fears are real. That side's fears are imagined. That's not true.
Welcome to Making Peace Visible, the podcast that focuses on peace, conflict, and the media. I'm your host, Jamil Simon. Today, we have the pleasure of talking to a fellow podcaster and bridge builder, Monica Guzmán. Monica is a journalist who works for a unique organization called Braver Angels. Her podcast is called A Braver Way. Both the organization and the podcast are doing heroic work trying to bridge the sharp divides that characterize life in America today. Indeed, the polarization we've all been feeling was made manifest in the recent U.S. election. Braver Angels and Monica's podcast are part of the same information ecosystem that Making Peace Visible is part of. Organizations promoting alternative, constructive ways to deal with conflict. It's great to be able to talk to Monica at this challenging moment in our history about bridge building activities as a way to build understanding and reduce conflict across divides. Monica, one thing I love about your podcast is your intense curiosity and your love of new ideas and different ways to think about things. You delight in taking an idea and looking at it upside down in every which way. Given what's going on in America, we have lots to talk about today, so thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, just to give us some context, what are the overarching goals of Braver Angels and by extension, your podcast?
It's a bit intangible, but one of the ways to sum it up is that Braver Angels is not out to change people's minds on the issues, but to change people's minds about each other. We are primarily working on the problem of trust across the political divide because it's glue that is necessary for so much of what makes our civic society, our democratic republic thrive, and conflicts resolvable without trust. It's sort of like doing all that without fuel. As for the podcast, the mission of the podcast itself is to equip people with the tools they need to bridge the political divide and to confront the barriers in their way. So we're really, really focused on that, finding tools, trying to articulate them, extracting them from the stories of our guests, and then making them accessible to our listeners.
Monica, your mission statement on the Braver Angels website says, "Where we go from here is up to us." Who is us?
Well, all of us, everybody.
It's a tall order.
Yeah, it is. It is. But we know from the history of social movements that not 100% of everyone needs to participate in a movement for it to be powerful. It's about penetrating, deep enough and reaching the hearts of folks who are already there. They just maybe don't know that they're not alone in their exhaustion and in their eagerness to do something and in their hope.
There's a poll that you cited, a Pew Research poll that you cited on your website, which talked about 65% of Americans feel exhausted when thinking about politics these days.
Yeah, and I'm thinking it's probably more than that since the poll was taken. It depends on how you define politics, but people exhausted by the effect of politics on their lives, the challenge, the wearying distress, the effect on relationships, the stress on a sense of peace and stability. I think that's pretty widespread.
Yeah, no, it is. The election was more decisive than a lot of people expected. Instead of a 50-50 split, we saw a rightward shift in many parts of the country. Given the results, can you make a case for why red and blue Americans should still try to work together?
Oh my gosh, yes. So many. Where to begin? I'll say this. I will speak for myself. I don't want to be dragged every time I lose into the next phase of American life. Are we entering this phase of kind of whiplash back and forth? Is there something so difficult about finding stability now that it might be extraordinarily hard for any party to gain more than 4 years of stability? I don't know. That's one. That's one case. It's just who wants to be dragged? The amount of misery and pain and fear the sharpness that exists among folks on the losing side right now is tremendous. The gap, the emotional gap between that and, the far end on the other side, which is joy and relief and hope and excitement about the next 4 years. So that's one. And what's happening is I've heard from so many people. Just yesterday, somebody texted me, my parents voted for the winning candidate. I didn't realize they had, and I'm not speaking to them. That's it. So the kind of distress that it's causing, I just don't think is something we want in the long term if we can help it. So that's one. And it's another big one is the effect on relationships. It hasn't gone away. I don't think we're in an election where people are going, oh, we lost. So, let's just move on. That's not where we are. It's a distress. It's a distrust. And whatever happens in our elections, that distress and distrust is not going away. We're not burying the hatchet and moving on. And in many cases for very good reasons. It's because we're not connecting across this divide. We're not feeling heard and seen by the other side. It's a tug of war where it feels like we're spinning farther apart every time. And I don't know where that's headed, but it's not fun.
No, it's not. I mean, I think the work that you and Braver Angels do and that we're part of as well, it just got harder as a result of the recent election. But at the same time, more important and more urgent.
Yes, definitely. And I think, it's become more urgent in people's lives because of the actions they're considering taking as a result. Because the losing side happens to be the liberal progressive side, I think there are a lot of folks wondering if they need to break relationships, and that's a pretty stressful thing that they're going through. Meanwhile, folks on the red side have their own concerns. Many of them are, really, really happy and hopeful, and they just want to build the future. And I talked to a friend of mine who, voted for Trump and is saying, I'm just not sure that I have the energy anymore to go and talk to Blues who are so distressed and in despair about things that I don't even think are going to happen. I think their fears are really exaggerated. I think our information landscape is so broken, and I don't even know where to begin to explain it to them, but I want to go build the future. And so that's another reason that people are going to want to pull away.
In an Instagram post you made a few days after the election, you said you're experiencing a lot of anger. Now, you're a liberal, and a lot of liberals are angry right now, but you're angry about something a little different. You said you're angry because we have a culture that has allowed a lot of narratives about other people to go unchecked. And you talked about misinformation, not about facts, but misinformation about what's in the hearts of other people. Can you explain what you meant by that?
I am still angry about this. I'm a little more tired than I am last week when I said it. But I think the anger is, it's changing into kind of determination. But the misinformation that we typically talk about is about facts, and it's about events. And, my fellow journalists are on a warpath against that. The misinformation we do not talk about is the misinformation about what's in people's hearts. This is the kind of misinformation that journalists are not on the warpath on in the same way. And I'm angry about that. I'm angry about the campaigns, the political campaigns, being accountable only for trying to win, which makes sense. That's their job. They will do whatever it takes to try to win. They will use the easiest emotional tools, which include, at the very top, fear. They will ramp up fear as a mobilizing tool because when you're really afraid of something, you can't think about anything else. What a beautiful way to try to mobilize people into action, right? Makes sense. But it is cruel. And in fact, I think it's abuse. I think it's abuse of the citizenry. I don't think it's right. And the thing I'm so angry about is that most people don't see it as abuse. They see it as righteous, and it's not.
Yeah. One person who studied the way our brains work, they call it hijacking the amygdala.
Yeah.
It's just going right to that very primitive part of our brain, that's motivated by fear more than anything else.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll say this, one of the big problems right now across the political divide, the big assumption that people are making over and over again is my side's fears are real. That side's fears are imagined. That's not true. I've talked to plenty of people across the divide, really genuine, open conversations, and what's in people's hearts, what I have seen that's in people's hearts tells me that is not true. Something closer to the truth is that each side has a mix of fears that are grounded in very reasonable concerns, backed up by what's going on, and they have fears that are grounded in hyperbole, exaggeration, and rhetoric that is not serving us. So each side has to figure out the difference. But of course, the winning side kind of doesn't because they won.
Well, looking at it at a meta level, I mean, the winning side, maybe the media and they're getting lots of clicks and people's eyeballs are glued to the screens and they're making money off of this. But we're losing in a big way, I think.
Wait, who's your we and who's your they in that?
They being the media, that is social media platforms and the MSNBCs and the Foxes. And we are the people getting anything done, getting any legislation passed, making our lives better. I mean, we're losing.
No, and let me say this, and I'll just put on my radical hat. The emotion that makes the least money is steadiness. But if you have a sharp emotion that is preoccupying, then you're going to want to give your attention to something that informs, that affirms those emotions, whatever's underneath them. You're going to need to give your attention to that. Maybe you think you're finding healing, and maybe you will. Maybe you think you're finding connection. Maybe you think you're finding revenge. But all those things can take us away from ourselves if we're not careful. When we try to find these solutions and these connections and this healing in spaces where, look, social media is not social. We are surrounded by voices, but the way the brain works, we're not seeing those voices as fully human. What we're doing mostly is projecting onto those voices some kind of cartoon about who's behind them. And really what a lot of social media is us ruminating, talking to ourselves, thoughts bouncing around. And I'm just starting to think we've got to change that ratio. Pull away, look for healing and connection, look for more information with the primary sources of the people around you. And whenever possible, not just people around you who think like you. Really, really, like if you have that conversation with just one person on the other side and it's genuine and it's open and it's curious and it's non-judgmental, I just think you get so much more bang for your buck off that one conversation, right? Than 1 hour scrolling through the reactions out there.
It's interesting to note that podcasts played a role in this past election. I mean, from what I understand, listening to some of the postmortems, Trump and Vance appearances on popular bro podcasts like Joe Rogan and Theo Von's were effective in attracting younger male voters. And Harrison Walsh hit the podcast circuit also. Harris was on Call Her Daddy, where she spoke about reproductive rights, that the show's audience of young women, meant something to them. As a podcaster who's trying to build bridges, do you have any thoughts about that, about the role of podcasts in this thing?
I've thought about it a bit since the election, kind of along the lines you're talking about. And one thing that is really unique about podcasting is its intimacy. It's the only medium, I would say, and I'm including television. I don't think television does this. It's the only medium where the conversation itself and the dynamics give off a lot of information, a ton of information. With TV, there's all these visuals as a distraction of what the anchors are wearing and the flashy stuff on the screen and your brain going to the ticker on the bottom and all of that. It's a medium that doesn't seem to speak so much to a massive audience as it does to each and every listener. Plus, audio in isolation has this extraordinary power. So listeners are hearing my frustration, right? I don't think you can hear it. You're hearing my exhaustion. You're hearing all of it. And I think that podcasting communicates more of the human stuff underneath the words, because we forget that language has always been an imperfect tool of communication. It's the best thing we've got. Words are the best thing we've got. But if you really think about where meaning lives in our hearts. We try to transmit it through words, but boy, can that be challenging, especially when language itself has become divided. So it's only through podcasting sometimes. You might hear from someone who disagrees with you, but you hear the meaning. You hear more of that human stuff. And so the language doesn't become the only thing that's carrying meaning. You're hearing the tone, you're hearing the care, you're hearing the emotion, you're hearing more. So I think that there are a lot of people, and I'm just making this up. I don't have data for this. This is a gut. I think that there are a lot of people who have discovered podcasting as a way to connect with humans far away from them that is unmatched by anything else.
Yeah, it's been a real eye-opener for me. You have a background in journalism. You were a daily news reporter in Seattle, and you did a Neiman Fellowship where you studied how journalists can better meet the needs of a participatory public. From our point of view, that's a great question. How did you come to this sort of bridge-building work you're doing now?
After that fellowship was the 2016 election. And I had planned to continue my journalism career, just with a little boost and let's see what's next. I started a publication in Seattle, a city I absolutely love and I'm still in. And that publication was all about where others in media are distant. We want to be close. We want to be closer to people, to the heartbeat of the city, how local life can add meaning and purpose to somebody's day. And what ended up happening was in doing the Evergrey, that was the name of the publication.
We have a journal called Nuance.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Evergrey was not just because Seattle is supposedly constantly covered in clouds, but also because gray is, the blend of black and white. It's the color of nuance. Well, what I realized was in my personal life, I was struggling with the political divide within my own family because my parents voted Republican and I voted Democrat. And I was mirroring so much of what was going on across the country, this tear that was getting bigger and bigger and the effects of that on our lives. So while I'm working on this wonderful publication, about getting close to people where others are distant, I'm experiencing this in my personal life. And I think the two threads just kind of tied together. And I realized I really care about the political divide. I really care about trying to find nuance here because I really care about people not being lonely, people finding meaning. I believe that relationships are a beautiful source of that for people. And anything that gets in the way of that becomes really important. And understanding across the political divide was getting in the way of that. So I think I just found myself hopping over. And I really did just find myself hopping over. It wasn't strategic.
No, I mean, that was one of the first episodes of yours that I listened to. And I was very moved. Your conversation with your mother and your dad in that episode. It was very poignant. So this is a clip from one of Monica's early episodes where she talks to her mother about the divide that separates her. Her mother voted for Trump and she wanted to understand why.
When we come to a place where we don't agree on something, we do research together. We go in and Google it together. We search for the answer and then we see, oh, there you go. Usually we're both a little bit right and a little bit wrong.
Yeah, that's happened a couple of times. I remember, in particular was that time at your house. You and I were having a thing about kids in cages, that policy. Right. And you were saying, this started with Obama. And I was like, no, it didn't. Or like, it couldn't have really. And then we looked it up and parts of it did start during the Obama administration. And I guess we just there's a lot of things I think we do to get to the point where we can learn together.
Monica, what do you think is the value of you and your mom sitting down and doing some research together?
Oh, it's a lot. I've been thinking about that more and more recently because going back to media, mostly the way people consume their information is alone, themselves and the screen. So the opportunity to check with somebody else or watch someone else's reaction to the same piece of information you're looking at is gone, right? So those moments where my mom and I have actually gotten to that point in a conversation where we realize we disagree on what's true, and then we're able to say, well, let's look it up. It's tough because there's that moment where I go, oh, I don't want to look it up. Like, what a waste of my time. And she'll kind of think the same thing. We both have to get over that. for ourselves to do it. But learning together, I think, would be, if I could wave a magic wand, I would have more and more of us look up information together because we would absorb it very differently.
But a lot of us are conflict avoidant. I mean, especially in families that are divided politically.
Well, I'd say I understand that people need time. Right now, after the election, there's been deep wounds that are being felt, right? Particularly on the blue side, toward the victor, of course. But it'd be one thing if I were here going, no, like hop right back in. It's going to be okay. I don't think that that's emotionally practical. People need to find their own way. What I would recommend, I suppose, is if some part of you really doesn't want to just leave it at, I don't want to talk about this, or I'll never talk about this, or I don't even want to see them at Thanksgiving. I mean, honestly, check out some episodes of A Braver Way, because we've got stories of people who have been in exactly that position and have worked their way. Sometimes it's been hard. A lot of times it's been easier than you think, toward reconciliation, toward repair, toward a stronger relationship than they could have ever imagined with the person that they were thinking they could never talk politics to. So these things are real. We tend not to talk about them. One of the things that we're doing in A Braver Way is making sure those stories are surfaced so people realize they're not alone and you can take this journey.
But it's a tall order. It's not easy for people.
No.
But the beauty of both what you do on your podcast and what Braver Way does in real life, so to speak, is, you're giving guidance on how to cross those divides and achieve some level of reconciliation.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, we say, obviously, it's the tools to equip people, to bridge the divides, but the tools don't mean a lot without stories. So the first ingredient really is, we talk to folks who have demonstrated courage in bridging the divide in some way. And what we do is we bring out the story. What were you feeling before? What were you thinking going in? And then what happened? What did you do? What did you try? What was the outcome? And I think that in a society that has lost so much faith in each other and is struggling to find trust, it really is seeing what is possible and knowing that it's real, to believe that the tools are even worth trying.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the use of language on your show and in politics. One convention on A Braver Way is that you refer to people on the left side of the political divide as blues and on the right side as reds. Why use this language instead of Democrat or Republican or liberal and conservative?
Yeah, there's a few reasons. One is that we don't want to tie political leaning to a political party just because political parties are their own beasts and machines. I know plenty of conservatives who don't feel an attachment to the Republican Party. I know plenty of liberals who have strong critiques of the Democratic Party. So that's one. The other thing, it is working to get toward something that is more about ideology than politics, but it is beginning at that binary. It's beginning at the place where our division at least lives. Now, there's a lot of good, really good criticism that I believe toward why are we keeping this a binary? There's no nuance there. And I agree. There isn't nuance there. We can't boil it down to red and blue. But I also believe in the principle that you have to start where people are. And our society's story about itself is that it is desperately divided between red and blue. So let's start there. Let's start there and pull the nuance from there. So that's one of the big reasons that we do it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because it takes a sting out of it,
Yeah.
In other words, you use the term Democratic Republic to describe the United States, which that's perfectly accurate. But I mean, like everything, it's intentional. What's the thought process behind that?
That's extremely intentional. Conservatives, many of them really cringe when our government is described, usually in the mainstream media, just as a democracy. They really cringe because, of course, our government has lots of elements that are pure democracy based on popular vote, based on majorities, based on direct people to government rule. But the founders did not make a democracy. The founders made a constitutional democratic republic. That's what we are. We have lots of parts of our government that are representative, where we elect people to represent us. That's a republic. So it's one of the places conservatives see a lot of bias in the mainstream media, because when you call something a democracy, you just happen to be leaning toward the parts of of our systems that happen to favor Democrats, or at least they did until this election, because the Republicans just won the popular vote. But we use Democratic Republic because we know that that term marries something that is eternally part of the tension of our nation. I mean, you can go all the way back to Hamilton and Jefferson, states' rights versus federal. You can go all the way back to so many debates, right? The Senate versus the House. The Senate is more Republic and the House is more Democrat, but they're both elements of Republic. So it's just more accurate. It reaches more people. And I think it does send the signal that we're not just saying what everybody else is saying because everybody else is saying it. We're trying to think about what we're saying.
Right. Well, we're in such a polarized place right now. It seems like there's very little neutral territory. You did an interesting episode about civic rituals and the way we start meetings. Your guest was Steve Saltwick, who happens to run a Braver Angels group in Austin, Texas. Here's a clip of Steve talking about a practice that he thinks starts a gathering off on the wrong foot.
The dilemma, I think, is, and I think this is very, very common in some places, right, is this ritual of opening a meeting with "what are your pronouns?" That statement asserts a given worldview on gender identity. That is not an accepted view of everybody, myself included, right? So from the start, it's like, wait a minute, this is setting up a framework that I don't agree with, right? And that's a challenge. That's a problem. We all welcome people who want to use pronouns, to work on hard problems. That's not the issue. It's making me share, quote, my pronouns, which sets up a framework that I fundamentally don't agree with. So it chills speech. If you're going to be the guy that doesn't do it, right? I mean, man, now you're in the out group.
Wow, that's tough. And that's really a thoughtful comment. It's a ritual that's meant to be inclusive of individuals who would otherwise be in an out group. But Steve says it makes people like him feel excluded. From this perspective, it can trigger an explosion of resentment. How do you work around something like this so you can have a meaningful dialogue across differences?
Right. Well, it really begins with questioning your own assumptions. One of the consequences of our political divide is that many things have become invisible to people on either side. Lots of people think I'm being perfectly inclusive. Lots of people think I'm being perfectly welcoming, and this is the right and the left. And because we don't communicate across the divide anymore, we're not doing what used to be organic ways of just checking in and realizing that something's not landing with people. So this is just one example of a place where in our civic life, there's spaces with all the best intentions that have, without even knowing it, excluded lots of people. So there's a reckoning we need to do with that. I think Steve is exactly right about frameworks. You want to get people together to build up their society, work together across difference, and you set up a framework that puts an assumption, an assertion of something that might be debatable over everybody, then you are sending a signal about who belongs and who does not. And I'm very convinced that this is going to be part of the very hard work that we need to do going forward.
No, I think that's very true. Monica, thank you so much for taking your time to join us today, because it's an interesting time to be talking about these issues, and you're an interesting person to be talking about them with. So thank you.
Thank you, Jamil, and thank you for your questions. These were great. Got me thinking.
You can find Monica Guzmán's podcast, A Braver Way, wherever you listen to podcasts. She's also written a book. It's called I Never Thought of It That Way: How to Have Fearlessly Curious Conversations in Dangerously Divided Times. Learn more about Braver Angels and find a chapter near you at braverangels.org. The Making Peace Visible podcast is produced by Andrea Maraskin with help from Faith McClure. I'm Jamil Simon. Let us know what you think of the show. Email us at info@makingpeacevisible.org, or better yet, give us a review on Apple Podcasts or leave a comment on Spotify. Making Peace Visible is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to amplifying stories and conversations about peace and reconciliation in the media. Your donations help us keep going. This season, it's easier than ever to give. Just go to makingpeacevisible.org and click the donate button on the top right. You can give directly using a credit card, PayPal, Venmo, your bank account via ACH, or by check. Thanks so much for listening, and talk soon.